I'll start with, there's a lot been said this morning. I don't want to look at a perspective on the future of cities just yet. I would like to first start by saying that IIM Ahmedabad has, for a very long time, much before since I was at IIM, which I've been for now the last 6.5 years, been involved in research which has sort of a very large focus on urban management, primarily looking at things like transportation planning. So I've tried to bring, instead of trying to look at the different centers I've tried to bring together here, put on this slide, the different aspects of urban planning management that are undertaken in the institute as a whole by different faculty members, by different groups in the institute, by different departments, because quite often our work has this sort of integrated way of coming together, given that we are in some ways differentiated by these functional management areas, but then we have special research groups that bring together topics of concern to the wider faculty. So transportation planning, for example, has been around for a while. We've looked at models of public-private partnerships, other forms of working between government, private sector, and other organizations. These have been roads and aviations. Roads, aviation, and shipping has been, a big area of research. One of the most, in the last 10 or 15 years, the area of climate change, the relationship between energy needs and development has been a very large research agenda in the institute. And two of our faculty members have been involved with the IPCC in drafting work on climate change. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're also developing a center on low carbon economies. That's the concerns come out from urban pollution. The concerns come out from urban resources and how they're projected into the future. For example, even though we have projects, urban projects in Ahmedabad that have water as a centerpiece, our colleagues who have been doing this second generation modeling would say that some of these projects don't really belong in Ahmedabad because we won't have this kind of water in 30 years to use for urban leisure, for example, and the pressure would be to use it for drinking or other uses. So there is this work around the energy development nexus that's quite a critical focus at the institute. We've had an area of urban planning, urban management, which looked at services, municipal finance, and the process of reforms in the decentralization-related reforms. More recently, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, is we've had a focus, what we think is something that hasn't been addressed by very broad technical base for looking at cities and future of cities, is to directly engage with urban communities. And this doesn't only mean a small fraction of people who are poor, who are considered people who live in slums, but a broad range of urban communities across the city where very critical issues that often don't find their way into this notion of city making in the future, things like livelihoods and informal markets. What we've seen in the last 15 years is not a drop in the informal livelihood sector. We've seen a massive growth. To say that informalization will be taken care of more technical interventions would be almost disregarding history. So we've had this critical focus on trying to understand how urban projects, urban development is related to displacement of habitat, livelihoods, and a whole number of things that are broadly the ambit of trying to understand cities as communities and not cities as sums of various kinds of technically specified nodes and hubs and spokes and wheels, which are basically metaphors for how we tend to look at cities, more than the people within them. My colleagues have looked at the role that mobile technologies have played in supporting urban livelihoods, in supporting livelihoods of people in the informal sector. We've also looked at health, sanitation, sewerage, education, and schooling. These are critical aspects of management that often sort of get subsumed under other heads, but this is it's kind of a core focus of how we look at cities and urbanization, and not something that is something that needs to be dealt with once we've urbanized. So this notion that once we've urbanized and we look at all of these other things to do with human development seems to not be the way in which we think about cities. And we think that without having all of these things together, we don't have this thing called urbanization. We have maybe a very partial view of what cities are. And I think that's other colleagues in schools of economics and finance look at land and economic development, and we have an entire center called Center for Infrastructure, Policy and Regulation that's dedicated to looking at all the facets of urban management, basically focused on infrastructure needs, again, across populations, and not simply only certain sectors and their growth drivers, but in a more holistic way. Although the focus does start from drivers of growth. In the sphere of urban governance and decentralization, our focus has absolutely, in terms of core, been about bringing back politics, bringing back issues of local democracy into city making as a very core process, as something that is critical to the way in which cities are going to be made. Without political contestation, we basically envisage cities as authoritarian regimes, which is not the direction in which we would like to imagine our cities, because then it will be a matter of more policing, more surveillance, more control, more authoritarianism. And this is a dangerous trend that we find quite often in the way that city making is talked about. So our focus has been on local democracy, local institution building, and local capacities for managing resources. In doing that, we've put a lot of focus into how there's a wide range of research into how communities are involved in local governance processes, how they can be involved, how they should be involved in process of decision making at the local level, at the city level. We've engaged in both research and classroom activities in a very systematic way for about 5 years now, in trying to understand ways in which communities mobilize and provide support for their participation on resource-related politics and policies. So it's the idea that a wide range of people, not just, again, informal sector workers, are simply objects that belong to technologies, or objects that would be simply controlled or subjected to technologies, but actually make meaning of technologies, use technologies, and are active participants in creating how these technologies should be used, is our principal focus. What we have done is organized across the city in Ahmedabad as well as elsewhere, and we've had a lot of public officials who've supported many of these initiatives that are collaborative forums for scenario development, planning, and mapping. So the ways in which we've looked at how urban planning is done, quite often, I mean, I'll give you the example, something that everybody might have resonance with right now. It takes about 20 or 25 minutes of rain in Ahmedabad, which is supposed to be a really well-planned city, to be absolutely waterlogged, right? The way in which these visuals depict the city, its roads, broad roads, nice roads, now have amazing amount of craters. The roads are waterlogged, we have craters, but if you would only look at the technical specifications, the money that's being spent on these things, you wouldn't sort of know it, right? So what we've been trying to do is really critically look at how ecology of space is linked with human habitation, human activity, and not something that can be ignored or taken outside the ambit of city making. Thank you.